Hello and welcome. I lost a friend, lament with me, one of my oldest friends, from when I was a law student, my best friend, in fact, who told me that he was offended that I had strayed from prophecy into politics and didn't want to be associated with my views anymore. This was very, very painful. We'd been very close for most of our lives. Although he's a very well-paid lawyer, and so, in fact, a spectacularly well-paid lawyer. And so one might say that he's part of the new elite, the them as the opposed to us. He was passionately opposed to Brexit, and I think very COVID conformative. And I think the household subscribes to degrees of feminism that I would find difficult. So perhaps we've been on a trajectory of separation for a while. And he was particularly offended, he said, by my analysis of the King's Christmas speech. My answer to him, as it is to other people who think that straying into the political arena is problematic for Christians, and perhaps a betrayal of spirituality, of metaphysics, of the supernatural, is that the progressive culture has brought politics to us. In other words, it has taken political moves to cancel us for our views on marriage, for our views on Islam, for our views on sexuality. These have been untroubled for a long time until left-wing progressive politics decided to try and cancel us and make us illegal. So if we find ourselves talking politically, it's not because we want to or because we're making what I think was the mistake that was made in the 60s and the 70s by liberation theology and left-wing Christians to adopting a socialist outlook of justice and equity. It's because politics has parked its tanks on our lawn. And I want to talk particularly about Islam today, which is very difficult and may soon become completely illegal. Partly because of the local elections that took place recently and the fact that we've now got a general election. And because it seems to me that Christians on the whole know almost nothing about Islam, and secular people even less than nothing. And so it's worthwhile, I think, trying to reiterate some facts. A friend of mine who's a Catholic journalist phoned me up recently and said that he was very alarmed because of the way, after Nigel Farage had talked to Trevor Phillips, a man I have the greatest respect and admiration for, it seemed as though Nigel Farage was either being lured into or trying to avoid being caught up in blaming Muslims. We shouldn't blame Muslims, said my Catholic journalist friend. They're very nice, many of them. And they are indeed very nice, many of them. Most of them are our decent neighbours, though in increasing numbers, which is in itself problematic. And yet, in the local elections, Mankoo Ali, who was the Green Party candidate in Leeds, gave the most extraordinary outburst on winning, yelling Allahu Akbar, and said, "This is for Palestine." And it suddenly became clear that under a Green Party ticket, Islamic politics in Palestine, and particularly Islamic views against the Jews, were becoming part of the mainline political arguments. So that once again, this is not us becoming political. They're bringing politics to us. I want to talk too about the definition for Islamophobia, because it's really very serious. For once, the National Secular Society and I are on the same side. I've been arguing against them in the media for a very long time. But they have been profoundly worried about the new definitions of Islamophobia. And in case you don't know, there's an all-party parliamentary group that is trying to foist a definition of Islamophobia on us that will make almost all discussion of Islam illegal, and in fact would make what I am saying here, illegal. And I'd like you just to stay with me for a bit. I've got to read some stuff out, which can be really quite tedious, but it's very important. But what I want to do, just give you some hope, stay with me, because the statistics say that people often lose interest after about 7 minutes, and the good stuff's going to come near the end, I hope, the useful stuff. Is that I want to talk about the way in which, what a Christian response is to the problem that we're facing. But first of all, here's the new definition, and you can see why it's a problem. Islamophobia, not that there is such a thing as Islamophobia. Let us start off by saying that the whole talk of phobias is a hijacking of the language of psychology and of Freud's understanding of neurosis, which is completely unscientific, unpsychological, and is a political trap and a device. Arachnophobia, yes, if you have an unjustified fear of spiders. You might have a properly justified fear of spiders, in which case it wouldn't be a phobia. It would be a justified instinctive reaction that biology and evolution has placed in us. But if it's an unjustified and neurotic one, how are we to know who makes that judgment? Then we talk about phobias. But Islamophobia, there's no such thing, of course. However, the all-party parliamentary group wants to turn this, make this the definition. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Now, this is disastrous at many levels. Why? First of all, Islam and racism have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. Islam covers all races. There are English Muslims, there are French Muslims, there are Arab Muslims, there are Indonesian Muslims, there are Australian Muslims. If you find Islam difficult, or indeed you find Muhammad difficult, it's not based in their race, it's based in what they say, what they do. But here, it's being hijacked and linked to racism. Actually, I have to tell you that I have difficulties with the concept of racism itself. But that's a much more complicated... Not because I believe in being hateful to people who appear different from me. Quite the opposite. But because I believe there is no definition and there is no science. And we're dealing with a different problem. The problem is original sin. And I think we should approach it on the basis that we suffer from original sin and not construct a politicized, psychologized form of thought crime instead. But that's a completely different talk, and it's so difficult. I haven't yet managed to find a way of doing it without the fear that I'm bound to be seriously misunderstood. So let's assume there is such a thing as racism. Well, of course there is, in the sense that there are people who dislike other races and are prejudiced against them for bad reasons. At that very primitive level, of course, there's racism, and of course it's execrable. But Islam is not, a fear of Islam is not rooted in racism. But what does this definition go on to say? It says a type of racism that targets expression of Muslimness. What is that? What on earth is Muslimness? We have no idea what that is. I mean, it's impossible to describe. But here's much, much worse. Or perceived Muslimness. Well, this is the thought crime that the left are bringing in, that if the victim thinks you are being unkind, unpleasant, derogatory, victimizing, then you are being. This is the terrible subjectivity that Tony Blair introduced in the Equalities Act, which is the platform on which all thought crime is based. It's whatever the victim thinks you thought, which is impossible, both in terms of jurisprudence and the criminal law. Now, if this is imposed upon us, we have a new blasphemy law, and but it gets much worse. Here are the things they want to stop us saying. So, what would a reaction against Muslimness or perceived Muslim, or a perceived reaction against Muslimness constitute? They give some examples. Calling for, aiding, instigating or justifying the killing or harming of Muslims in the name of a racist or fascist ideology or an extremist view of religion. Killing Muslims? Obviously not. Harming Muslims? What is it to harm Muslims in the name of a racist or a fascist ideology or an extremist view of religion? Does it constitute a harm for Muslims to resist Sharia law? They might say so, in which case you were reacting against a perceived Muslimness. So if we want to say we don't want Sharia law in our country, we don't want the beating of women, we don't want the killing of apostates, we are immediately being Islamophobic. 2, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing or stereotypical allegations about Muslims as such, or Muslims as a collective group, especially but not exclusively, conspiracies about Muslim entryism into politics, government or social institutions. This is problematic. It's a fact that the level of Islamic presence in the Home Office and the Foreign Office may have had something to do with the experience we had with Syrian refugees, that a disproportionate number of Syrian refugees who were accepted into this country were Muslim. There should have been a statistical number who were Christian, because there are Syrian Christians, formidable and wonderful people. We accepted hardly any of them. What was the level of prejudice in government circles that meant that we almost only accepted Muslim refugees from Syria and no Christian ones? One has to ask the question. But this now becomes Islamophobic. What do we do when we say that we're concerned about Muslim entryism into politics, when we notice that there are a large number, about 24 Islamic mayors, when someone like Mohsin Ali, having been elected under a green ticket, shouts this is for Palestine? Are we not allowed to be concerned that Islamic policies, Islamic values are being represented in our politics, for example, from a green candidate, under the guise of ecology? Well, no, that would be Islamophobic and criminal. In other words, you can't say it. A third one is accusing Muslims as a group of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing by a single Muslim person. So a single Muslim person goes into a Birmingham arena and blows them up. And we then say, this is representative of Islam. Well, it is. They said it was. Every time a Muslim terrorist commits a terrorist act, we are told either that it's a particular kind of Muslim terrorist, it's Islamism. There's no such thing as Islamism. This was invented to cover up the political expression of a religion that is both political and religious at the same time, which is something that's problematic for the Western mind to deal with. But this now becomes illegal to say so, even though it's true. Accusing Muslim citizens of being more loyal to the Ummah or their countries of origin or the alleged priorities of Muslim worldwide than the interests of their own councils, their interests of their own nations. Well, the difficulty here is, as Rafe, Heydel, Mankoo, a commentator, suggests, the statistics are against us. I'm going to take a deviation in going through this in order to bring you what the statistics are, because telling the truth about these statistics will become a thought crime, Islamophobic. So that, for example, we know, he says, that most UK Muslims, including educated Muslims, don't believe Hamas committed rape and murder in Israel, which reveals the difficulty in integrating increasing numbers into our country. We know that 81% of UK Muslims say they are Muslim first and British second. This is far higher in France, where it's 46, or Germany, 66. We know that 52% of Muslims believe it should be illegal to show an image of Muhammad. No more cartoons, no more anything. We know that 28% aspire for Britain to become a Sharia state, the whole of Britain, not even Muslim areas, the whole of Britain. We know that 9% of UK Muslims, of whom there are 9% of them, 350,000 people, are hardcore Islamists or support terrorism. We know that 52% of UK Muslims believe that homosexuality should be illegal. Amongst the rest of the population, it's 5%. 52% of Muslims want it made illegal. We know that 62% of Muslims believe in restricting freedom of speech to protect religion from criticism. Well, that's behind this definition of Islamophobia, of course. We know that 15% sympathise with fundamentalism, compared with, we need to describe what fundamentalism is. I'm afraid I find this is a problematic statistic, because he doesn't to describe what it is. I think he knows what I think I know what he means, but I'm anxious about using it. However, 15% to sympathise with Islamic fundamentalism compared with 6% in France or 7% in Germany. 19% respect, idolise Osama bin Laden, and 6% want to lead a completely separate Islamic life in the UK, a state within a state. 44% believe schools should be able to insist on a hijab or the wearing of a niqab, in other words, the complete clothing of Islamic women. A third oppose teaching of art and music in school. A third of Muslims believe, between the ages of 18 and 24, believe in bigamy and polygamy. And a third of UK Muslims between 18 and 24 believe that Muslims who leave the faith should be executed. That's a fairly terrifying number. How would integration take place if this is the case? Well, I may have lost you already with statistics. They're very tedious, but they give you some level of factual insight as to the proportions of the people who believe certain things. If we go back to the definitions, just a few more, there is, of course, applying double standards by requiring of Muslims behaviours not expected or demanded by other groups, as in loyalty tests. The problem is that Muslims are unlike other groups, and to some extent, therefore, it's not surprising, particularly if you're dealing with people who say they want either a separate state within a state or they have an allegiance to another nation than yours, to ask in terms of sporting or culture where their loyalties really lie. It tells you something about their priorities, although we know what those are already. Using the symbols and images associated with classic Islamophobia, Muhammad being a paedophile, claims of Muslims spreading Islam by the sword or subjugating minority groups to that rule. Well, the problem is, the evidence is that Muhammad did marry and have intimate relations with a 9-year-old girl, and it's very difficult to know what you would call that if you don't call it paedophilia. Muslims do spread Islam by the sword, and there's a very important book that one might want to read called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, which details what happened in Spain in the Convivencia. For about 20 years, the BBC was pushing very, very hard that the living happily together in Spain under Islamic rule. And a great deal of money was put into academic books promoting it. The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise quotes the propaganda, the academic propaganda put out by Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, all the major universities, Yale, Harvard, funded by Islamic money, and then gives the facts, which are entirely and exactly the opposite of the propaganda that's been put out about the Convivencia. The Convivencia was a very, very brutal period where Jews and Christians were treated as dhimmis. That was, they had to pay an exorbitant tax simply for existing in an Islamic state, and a great deal worse. This is not the place to talk about that. Or characterizing Muslims as being sex groomers. Well, the problem that we have here is that we have had sex groomers exclusively by Muslims in our country. So once again, we can't talk about that or tell the truth about that. Holding Muslims collectively responsible for the action of any Muslim majority state, whether secular or constitutionally Islamic. Well, here again, the difficulty is that the cries from the river to the sea are cries of genocide made by Muslims and Muslim states. And if an Islamic voice raises their voice to say this, we're no longer allowed to say this is representative of all the other people, all the other Muslims and Muslim states calling for it. This definition has been taken up by a number of councils already. And if it finds its way into law, parliamentary law, we have a new blasphemy law and we will be silenced. This is a matter of enormous importance. And what I want to do, I think, because knowing what people's attention is, I want to stop this particular video now, and then I'm going to do a second one in terms of what the solution is as Christians, how we as Christians might respond to this. But the first thing I want to say, which I'll repeat later on, is that at the root of this is the difficulty the Western Christian mind, the Western secular mind, has in understanding what Islam is. Islam is like nothing Western. It is a hybrid mixture of politics and religion. It is a religion that has political aspirations. It is a political and military policy that has a religious character. And we find this so difficult to get into our heads that we frankly can't deal with it. And part of the problem is that when we address Islam as a religion, we ignore its political aspirations to our peril, because here we can see emerging both in the local council elections and increasingly in the general election that's taking place. And if you read the book by Houellebecq called Submission, his novelist's projection of what's going to happen politically in France, we can't ignore the fact that Islam has very powerful political aspirations. But if we deal with Islam as a political event, then we don't understand it, because in fact it is driven, it is motivated, its self-understanding is as a religion, as a totalitarian religion. So here's a difficulty, and the problem is that in our culture, on the whole, most secularists, and indeed many Christians, regard Islam as a cousinly relationship of Judaism and Christianity, a sort of Arabic form of Middle Eastern Christianity. In one sense it is. In one sense Islam, of course, is a Christian heresy, a form of extreme Arianism. But in another sense it isn't. It's sui generis. It's a different thing altogether. And the question for us is how we respond as Christians to this, and I want to talk about that in a following video in order not to tax your attention and patience too much. God bless you. God keep you.